Segment 2, Western Civilization. Historian Gilbert Allardyce, quote, "For a time between the First World War and the campus protests of the 60s, all roads led to the Western Civ class. Classrooms filled, teachers multiplied, in the discussion sections, generations of teaching assistants began their apprenticeship in college instruction. Then came the collapse. As Stanford, where we're taping this program, was considering its curriculum in the 1980s, Jesse Jackson led hundreds of students in chanting, 'Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go.' The historian Victor Davis Hanson tells of giving a lecture about the history of the West and realizing about halfway through that most of the students expected him to talk about cowboys. That was what the West meant to them. Western civilization, great books, Athens and Jerusalem, gone. What happened?"
Yes, I was going to add great books to your mentioning of the Western Civ. Yes, those have gone. Those books make us think, and that kind of history presents us with the problems of our civilization. Western civilization is not one thing. It's, in a way, divided against itself in a very interesting way. The most important, perhaps, between church and state, between theology and philosophy. And so Western civilization is not a civilization which has one answer, one authoritative answer to everything, but it contains within itself problems and questions. So it's much more interesting and also more powerful than other non-Western civilizations, and we've seen that they've gradually watched Western civilization cover the globe and come to them and force them to make concessions to it. So Western civilization is something which is full of interest and full of questions.
And so one of the aspects of this I've always found puzzling is, just as you say, to study Western, so they're great books if you start with Homer and include the Hebrew scriptures and work your way through. It's not always a pretty picture, and moreover, the self-critique begins from the very beginning. Homer is filled with what we have to believe are intentionally morally ambiguous moments.
Surely.
You have the prophets in the Old Testament attacking the kings. Yeah. And so the openness of the civilization itself to protest from within, it's almost as though there's a very shallow notion that to study Western civilization is to come adoring in a simple-minded way to our own history, which is not the case at all.
That's right. As if it were all a canon enforced by some sacred authority. That's certainly not true. No.
You've written an essay back when Harvard was reconsidering its core curriculum in the 90s. You wrote an essay in which you made a number of specific recommendations. And alas, we don't have time to go all the way through your essay right now. But I'd like to, if you could give me a few sentences on each of these. You've got Western civilization as a recommendation you made for the Harvard curriculum. Quote, "A course that begins with Homer and ends somewhere in the vicinity of Nietzsche still makes a lot of sense." Why does it still make sense?
Those are, if you go through Homer to Nietzsche, mentioning, say, a dozen names, those would give you, and you read those books, those would give you the main alternatives behind our way of life today. And so in that way, it would be extremely relevant. Relevance was a demand of the late 60s, but they didn't ever get to it because they were afraid of permanence. What those great books and what Western civilization courses do is open you to the permanent problems of mankind and of human nature. The questions that return again and again. What is the good life? Is it a good thing to be ambitious? Or is it, in general, a bad and selfish thing to do?
By the time undergraduates matriculate at Harvard, that one's already been answered. Religion, quote, "Religion should not only be present but central in our curriculum."
Well, it's central in the lives of billions and billions of people, and it's also a central question in our society and, again, in our Western history. So do we live under God, Or are we left to our own devices to do what we wish or what we think right? What is the need for authority? What kind of God exists if there is a God? All these are the absolutely central questions, and we see it even in our time or in our age of science. Science cannot defend itself. Science doesn't have answers to the big questions that religion faces and attempts to answer.
The military, quote, "This is hardly taught at all," close quote.
It's amazing. For example, in my department, political scientists, a lot of them study civic engagement, the lack of civic engagement. Our society is too individualistic, too selfish. How do we get together? It never occurs to them that a person who volunteers to serve in the military is engaged in civic engagement. Mm-hmm. They think that it's all a matter of, well, to cite President Obama, community organizing. Right. You know, getting people together or holding hands while we pretend to tolerate each other.
America, quote, "Far too little is taught about America at Harvard."
We're much too apologetic about America. We are embarrassed that America is as powerful and as prominent as it seems to be, and there's a considerable doubt that we deserve to be in that place. Well, all right, let's look at the facts. How did we get to where we are? That would be one big question that undergraduate students ought to consider when it's their own country involved.